In this video, I'm going to show you 17 absolutely essential shortcuts in Logic Pro that will help you navigate it 10 times faster. Let's do it. The more you know your shortcuts, the quicker you can get your ideas from your head onto your computer. And minimizing the time it takes from brain to DAW will maximize your creative flow. It is absolutely a good idea to get familiar with all of these shortcuts and these tips and tricks that I'm about to show you. This video will be pretty fast-paced. If you don't understand something, you can always go back and rewatch it. Here we go. Let's start off with zooming. Something you'll be doing all the time in Logic Pro is zooming. Sometimes you'll need to zoom way in to directly line up a waveform, and sometimes you'll need to zoom way out so that you can see your entire track. And if you're using these little dials up here to do it, you, my friend, are wasting a bunch of time. To navigate your session quicker, get used to scrolling on your trackpad or mouse. The shortcuts are slightly different for each, so I'll explain both. For your laptop trackpad, you can use 2 fingers to scroll like normal. Then you can also use 2 fingers to pinch and zoom like normal. But pinching and zooming only works horizontally. To unlock the feature, all you have to do is hold down the Option button, and then you can scroll like normal using 2 fingers, and you can zoom in either way. For a mouse, you can use the Shift button and scroll to scroll horizontally. You can scroll normally using the scroll wheel, and then if you wanted to, you can also zoom in using the Option and Command buttons holding down and then scrolling. That will do the same result. You can also use the shortcut Z to zoom in automatically on the selected track that you have. For example, I can click this one here, click Z, and it will zoom in to fill the screen. I can toggle between this view and the view I had before by clicking Z. Let's say you're zoomed in like this and you have a bunch of tracks selected. You can click Shift D to deselect all the tracks, then click Z, and you can see an overview of your entire track. Now let's talk about one of the most used shortcuts I use, which are fade shortcuts. Fades are extremely important in music production, and I use them all the time to combine audio tracks and get rid of clicks, pops, etc. There are a couple ways to fade in Logic, but let me show you the easiest. When hovering over the end of an audio track, you can hold down Shift and Control to bring up the fade tool. Then you can drag out the fade as needed. Holding the same Shift and Control button, if I go to this fade, I can then adjust it after the fact. You can also draw a box around the end to start where the fade ends. And if you hold down the Shift and Control and go to the middle, you can adjust the curve of the fade as well. If you have 2 audio sections coming together like this, it might be a good idea to crossfade them. You can do the same thing holding Shift and Control and drawing a box over both of them to create a crossfade. You can adjust the crossfade in the same way using the curve tool in the middle and then using the at the top. Then you can also adjust the fades like normal from the top right here. To perform multiple clips at once, you can do this same technique by just select more than one clip, create the box, and they will have the exact same fade. Moving right along to the next tip I suggest, which involves splitting clips. Sometimes in your music, you'll want to separate the tracks you've made into multiple regions or parts. One way to do this is with the region selected that you want to split. You can use the shortcut Command T to make a split and divide it into 2 different parts. But what I find myself using more often is the Marquee tool. The Marquee tool is my default secondary tool slot for Logic. You can find that secondary tool slot by clicking up here. You can see Marquee tool is selected. Your secondary tool slot will activate anytime you press and hold down the Command button. You can see it switch between the cursor and then the marquee cursor right here. The marquee tool makes it really easy to cut audio to the grid because it automatically snaps to the beats and measures. It also makes it way easier to split up multiple clips at one time. With Command pressed down, create a box over where you want to separate. Then you can click inside of the box itself to make the cut. You can also duplicate this section without cutting the original track by holding down Command here, dragging the box like before, holding down Option before clicking in the box, and then dragging it down to a new track. This will create a new track with that part that you wanted, but it will leave the first track unaltered and uncut. I use this all the time for vocals. Next thing I want to talk about is Option clicking things back to 0. A general tip for buses, knobs, faders, and even plugins in Logic is that you can reset a lot of the parameters back to 0 with an Option click. Let me show you what I mean. Let's say we want to put this bus back to 0 for whatever reason, this volume bus. If I hold down Option and click it, it's going to be back to 0. We can reset that right here. Same thing goes for panning. If I pan this all the way to the right and I don't want that, I can Option click it back to 0. Same goes for buses. I can Option click it and it will go back to 0. Moving on to selecting tracks. Selecting tracks is a thing you'll do all the time in Logic, and it helps to know some helpful shortcuts. You can use Command A to select all of the tracks in your entire project, or all of the MIDI notes that you're working with. I use this a lot specifically for MIDI. Oftentimes, I'll double click on the MIDI track to open up the editor window, or you can also do that with E, and then I'll click Command A to select all of the ones in that specific region, and I'll quantize it or change the velocity or whatever I need to do. While working with MIDI in the editor window like this, Command A will only select this specific region. It won't select the other regions on the track. If you do want to select all of the MIDI notes on a track like this and affect them all at once, you can click on this part of the track right here. It will select all of them. And then you can see all of them are now selected, and you can adjust the velocity as need be. You can do the same thing for individual notes in your MIDI by clicking on the note actually in the piano roll right here, and you can see it selected all of them for all of the tracks. And when you can select the MIDI like this in a fast way, it will give you way more precision in editing your actual MIDI notes. There's also a couple more shortcuts that are extremely helpful for selecting tracks and regions that, if you don't know, are going to save you a ton of time. The first is shift clicking, which will allow you to select multiple things in a row as long as they're in order. For example, if I wanted to select all of these green synth tracks here, I could select the bottom one first, hold down shift, and then click on the top, and it will select all of them at once. I use this all the time. You can also use this in the mixer window as well, which can be really helpful. If I want to select tracks that aren't in order, you can do that by holding down Command and then clicking on each individual track that you want to select. You can also combine these two methods by using, say, the shift click method, and then using Command click to get rid of any ones that you don't want. Let's move on to copy and pasting track settings. A really great way of speeding up your workflow can come from copying and pasting your plugin settings from one track to another. If you like the plugins on one track, you can actually copy and paste all of them to another one and save you a bunch of time. I do this all the time, say from my lead vocal to my background vocals, because they often have the same processing. To do this, you'll want to open up the mixer window with X. Then choose the track you want to copy and click Option Command C. Then choose the track you want to paste to and click Option Command V. It will give all of the same settings as that first track. It will even have the fader settings, all of the sends as well. You can also access this by going into Settings, Copy Channel Strip Setting, and then Paste Channel Strip Setting on the one that you want to paste to. Sometimes you may only want to move over one plugin specifically onto your track because it's dialed in. Maybe it's a guitar amp or something like that. To do that, open up the mixer window once again and option drag that plugin from whatever track you want onto the next one. This will copy over all of the settings you had before and use the exact same parameters. Alternatively, if the tracks are far apart on the mixing window, sometimes you have a lot of tracks, it might be easier to copy and paste the settings in the track itself. If you look at Logic here and you open up the plugin, you can click on Copy up in the top left right here. And then if you open up a plugin with the same exact plugin, you can click on Paste to paste in all of the settings from before. This does require having the same plugin on both tracks, but like I said, if you have a lot of space in between your tracks on this mixer window, if you have a lot of tracks, it can be easier to do it like this. If you're getting anything from this video so far, go and show some love to the like button and subscribe to the channel to start making amazing sounding music. Moving right along to some window shortcuts. So I've talked about a couple of these so far, but they are very essential in navigating Logic Pro quickly. The ones I use the most are Y, which will open up your library, which will let you select different MIDI presets. E is for editor, and I usually use this to edit MIDI notes like this. X is for mixer, and I've brought this up before, but it brings up this classic analog mixer that you might know if you've worked on consoles. And then probably the most underrated and one of my favorites is I, which is the inspector window, and it will show you whatever plugins you have on the track you have selected, and then will also show you whatever track it's going to next. In this case, my stereo out bus. But let's say this bass here, I have all the plugins here, and then I also have all of the plugins on this bus on this summing track that right here. Very helpful. I'll talk more about those routing and the summing tracks in a couple tips down the line. Moving on to organizing plugins. In Logic, while you're selecting plugins, the process can be a bit tedious and can take a while, especially if you have a lot. Chances are you're going to use a handful a whole lot more than the rest. Instead of scrolling over and finding them each time, you can save and customize this menu by going up here into Logic, going into Settings, and Plugin Manager. Here you can make your own folders for your favorite plugins by dragging and dropping them in here. And once you do that, you can save your favorites, and so you don't always have to do that. I've added some of my favorites into Logic's stock plugin folder and how they've divided things, but you can also just make one called favorites and then put your favorites in there. Highly recommend instead of scrolling through all of these huge menus. Moving on to something very important in music production, which is automation. I've got some cool tips for automation. Automation is just whenever you change a setting over time. The most popular thing to automate would probably be volume, starting softer, getting louder, or the opposite. To access automation, click the A key on your keyboard. You can also click this little button right up here. Now, as you can see, all of these are defaulted to automating volume. If I click here, I can automate the volume just like normal. And as we go through time, this particular track will get louder and louder. Now, that's not what I'd recommend for changing the volume. In fact, this will probably set you back a couple steps if you choose to do it this way. Instead, I'd recommend turning off the volume if you've made any changes by clicking on this button right here. This will mean it won't read it at all. Then I would put a gain plugin after everything on your plugin chain. We're going to automate the gain plugin instead of the volume. To find it, you can go here, go to gain, and then click gain. We're going to do the same thing we did before, but now this time we're automating gain. This will give you the added benefit of getting the same results, getting the same volume gains, but now you can actually still use the fader, which is super important. If I were to automate the volume like before, the fader would be locked and any changes I made would have to be in the automation window rather than in the easy way of just using the fader itself. It takes a little longer to set up gain and automate it like this, but it will save a bunch of time in the long run, especially if you're going to adjust the fader after the fact. Another thing to really speed up automation is the latch feature. If you click on this button here, you can see a bunch of different ways you can change this automation. The default is read, which simply reads the automation lines that are there, but my favorite to use is called latch, especially if I'm working fast. Let's select it. Latch lets you adjust a parameter like reverb, or in this case, a high pass filter, and then print it all in real time to the song. As you can see, as I'm moving this, you can see that this line is changing right here. If I play the song in real time, I can adjust this, and you can see that Latch is going to move it accordingly. I use this instead of going through the menus. I find it much more intuitive to click Latch and then move the parameter as I want to, and then adjust it after the fact if I need to. After I hit Latch, if I'm satisfied with those results, I'll click back on read so that it doesn't change anything after the fact. That is important. If you don't change it back to read, anytime you make an adjustment and you're playing the track, it will automatically copy that adjustment. And the last automation trick you can use is to use the marquee tool to make boxes on the automation line. If you've got that marquee tool selected in your second tool slot, hold down Command, make a box like before, and now you can drag out perfect boxes of automation on your line. These are used to make precise moves, and sometimes it's easier to work like that. Next up, let's go over how to duplicate a track. Sometimes you might want to have a track with the exact same plugin settings, or maybe try another recording without having to set up all the inputs and outputs without deleting the one that you have. To duplicate, all you have to do is click on what you want and click Command D. It will show a track with everything in it as well. Once again, you can also select regions and then click Option Drag, and it will duplicate the exact thing that you had before. I use this all the time. Moving on to naming and color. If you're trying to work fast, it pays to keep things organized. And a great way of doing that is with color and proper names. Here are some shortcuts I use a lot to do that. While naming one track, you can name the next track by hitting Tab. This is helpful if you're changing the name of many tracks in a row. You don't have to leave the keyboard at all. To change the color of something, you can hit Option C on your keyboard. This will pull up the color wheel. Then you can select a region or select an entire track and change the color. Another thing I like to do is sometimes your arrangement view just gets cluttered with a bunch of like random audio samples like this. Let's say that, oh, I named this percussion. To change all of these at one time, I can Command A to select all, and then I can use Option Shift N. Oh, whoops. Oh, that was wrong. Then I can use Option Shift N to name all of the tracks exactly what my track names is. This just can clean things up instead of having all of the sample names that you used in it. Another thing I'm doing a lot to save time is by making track stacks. Track stacks are where you have multiple tracks going into one bus that you can adjust the volume of both of those. And you can also add plugins, add reverb to save you some time. I use this a lot for recorded acoustic guitar parts, which you can see here. I had a stereo microphone set up as I recorded this, so one of them I panned hard left, hard right, and then I send them both to a bus track, a track stack, so that I can turn them down together. This also saves me from having to duplicate every single individual plugin and alt drag onto each track. To make this really easy, just take all of the tracks that you want to group together, shift click them. You can do this with a bunch of different tracks. right click, and then click Create Track Stack. You can also do this with the shortcut Command-Shift-D. Make sure summing track is selected. I use summing track 99% of the time. This will allow you to use the volume like I just mentioned. Folder is simply for organizing. Now I can adjust all of the volume down at once. Moving along to octave jumping. A common thing I like to do with MIDI data is audition it in different octaves to see if it works better in the mix. For example, I might want to take this pad and just see how it sounds an octave higher. To do that, I can select the MIDI region and then click Option, Shift, up arrow, just to go up 1 octave, 12 semitones. You can do the same with down arrow. You can see that it also shows in the region how much you're going up and down, which can be really helpful. Now I can go back here, test out that new octave and see if it works better. You can also do this for individual notes in the MIDI region. Say, oh, I don't really like how this note is sounding. Let's put it down an octave, Option, Shift, down arrow, down a full octave from where it was. You can change it really easy. Moving on to flattening the comp folders, comp takes. If you tried recording in Logic, you probably come across their take folder system, which is usually pretty helpful. If you record multiple takes over the audio itself, each individual take will result in a new take that you can easily adjust as you need to. This will let you quickly compile the best parts together. This is great for selecting the best parts, but folders in this way have limited editing capabilities. You can't add fades, you can't easily adjust the gain, and a bunch more. For that reason, I use the shortcut Shift-Command-U to flatten the take and give me original audio regions back so I can use them and edit them like I normally would. If you don't like this take system folder as a default, you can change the settings by going into Logic Pro, Settings, and Recording. You can see that MIDI and audio have different setting recordings like this, and the cycle on will also change it if you want them to. I'd recommend sticking with the default, but you can experiment here and maybe go for create new track or track alternative. That leads me into my next one, which has to do with muting and hiding tracks. Now, before you flatten your tracks, you might have 20, 30 different recordings, different takes that you want to save just in case you want to go back. To do that, I'd recommend clicking H on your keyboard to bring up the hide track. When you click H on your keyboard, you'll see that H turns green up here, and you'll also notice that there's an H on the track itself. If we click H on the track itself, then click H again, you'll see that the track gets hidden. But we don't want Logic playing this in the background. Just because we hit it from our view doesn't mean that Logic's not going to play it. In order to do that, we could hit mute on our keyboard here so that we don't hear anything, but then Logic is still going to process all of these individual plugins and take up processing power. We're going to select the region and hit Control-M. This will mute the region itself, and it will also stop Logic from processing it like it normally would. This is way better. It's going to save on processing power. And then after we have H selected, we can hit H again, hide our track, and if we ever need it, we know it's there. You can also tell a track has been muted in this way. They save on processing power by this little blue dot right here. A workflow that I often find myself using is I'll duplicate the track so that I have all the same settings. I will duplicate this, I'll option drag down so that I have 2 copies. I'll mute one of them, hide it, go from there. I'll unmute this one. I'll hit Shift Option U on this one, and now I have a flattened track, but I also have all of my other takes if I need them. Moving on to something that you probably knew already, but if you didn't, this will save you some time. If you're working on a basic part and you know you want to get a quick EQ or reverb on it, you can very easily do that by hitting on this little box here. It will add a reverb to the next plugin slot in your chain, then you can affect it as you need to. It will also visually show you in this particular part here what is being affected with the reverb. You can hit this little box up here to add compression, and then when it's actually compressing, it will show you the ratio with a little purple line of how much is being compressed. You can see some of these. It's a pretty cool visual way of representing what's happening, and it is pretty helpful. If I'm doing more detailed EQ or compressor work, I might use different plugins than the stock plugins, but for some basic work, this is perfect. And the last thing I'll do to speed up my workflow is called bussing. Instead of adding reverb on every single individual track and adjusting it to taste, I find it much faster to add my reverb to a bus track instead. All you have to do to add to a bus is, you can even do this with multiple tracks using shift click like this. Add a new slot here, bus, and click on an empty bus track. You can see that an empty bus track was made at bus 16. You can tell because the input is at bus 16 here. We can name this whatever we want, reverb, whatever. We can add reverb here. Make sure that if you add a reverb, the mix is at 100% because we're using this as a bus track. Now, if we take these and we adjust bus 16, we can adjust the amount of reverb for all of these.
I don't match the light, and I feel the distance growing, but I'm still standing by.
Now, anytime you want that reverb, you can add it to that bus. Instead of just putting it on the track, you can go to bus, reverb, and then you can add it as you need to. You can also get rid of this really easily. You can select it here, no send, bow, bang, boom. Much faster than adding a new reverb plugin every time, and it will save you a bunch on processing power on top of it. Now, all of those tips are things I personally use as a professional producer every day to help speed up the music making process. But to be honest, speed itself won't mean a thing if you don't know how to produce in the first place, which is why I made this video here, which condenses 500 hours of the most potent music production advice I could think of, condensed into 25 minutes. Go check it out.